Hello, everyone. Welcome to another guest interview within Mindful Journey. I am so delighted that you're here with us and so excited to bring you our guest today. For those of you who are on live, you might have just heard some of the briefest side with Dr. Gail Rosseau and myself. I'm not going to highlight all components of her resume because it would be quite lengthy. She has done so many great things in the world of medicine and neurosurgery, but I think what you'll feel from her today is a genuine humility, a desire to help and to serve. And quite frankly, that's what led me to her when I first reached out cold. We've never met prior to today. Her response was very simply, happy to help. So it really meant a lot to me to hear from someone who, in the world of medicine and global neurosurgery, who's done so many amazing things, still has this desire to contribute, to give back, to serve, to help people beyond the mind from a neurological perspective. Perhaps we'll be filling their mind with wisdom and inspiration today and touching their heart, I hope, in ways that maybe she's not used to doing in a technical sense. She currently serves as a clinical professor of medicine, I believe. Let me get the exact terminology down. Clinical professor of neurosurgery at George Washington University. I am going to read just so I don't do you a disservice. She's the chairman of the board of trustees of the G4 Alliance. She's been a leader in global neurosurgery for many years, been in the field of neurosurgery for over 30 years. He is an adjunct professor at Barrow Neurological Institute, co-founder of the Global Alliance for the Prevention of Spina Bifida, and is on the advisory board of the National Churchill Leadership Center. Again, I know there are many other pieces to her resume, but beyond all of that, Dr. Rousseau is a mother and a wife and an avid marathon runner, which I'm excited to learn more about as well. With all of that being said, Dr. Rousseau, thank you again for agreeing to be here and very much looking forward to our conversation.
I am too, Adam. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. I'd love to start with what it is that got you into medicine and particularly why neurosurgery.
Well, I was one of those few people who knew early on that I wanted to be a doctor. In fact, this sounds so smug coming from a 13-year-old, eighth grader, but I remember writing in a graduation book. I feel so lucky that I know exactly what I want to do with my life. And so many of my fellow graduates don't know. This is eighth grade graduation. But and I had a few twos and fros between then and med school graduation. But I was always interested in medicine. And I think it was the combination, maybe it's sort of right brain, left brain, the desire to do something that was meaningful, that involved relationships and could help people with just a real interest in science. I've always been interested in science. In fact, in my family, you have to be the first person to get up and out of bed in the morning on Tuesdays because the New York Times has the Science Times on Tuesday, and we compete for who gets to that section first. So I think it was probably that combination of personal and scientific that led me to want to do that. And then also the knowledge and desire that whatever I chose to do as a career, I really did want to have a career that would last for many decades. I wanted to be a person who worked, so I envisioned, even as a 13-year-old, I hoped to be a wife and mother, but I also wanted to be someone who worked. And therefore, I wanted it to be meaningful work and work that would be evolving and interesting and changing during a multi-decade career. And medicine checked all those boxes.
Amazing. And what particularly about neurosurgery? Because when you're going through medical school, and I don't have a background in medicine, have interviewed a number of folks and a little bit of a nerd for it in terms of the fallibility that's involved, right, with just the human component. But forgive my naivety in this ask, but once you go to medical school, you don't have to make your designation right then, right? And if so, what was it about neurosurgery that said that's the specialty that I want?
Oh, that's a good question. But actually, I went to medical school to become a neurosurgeon.
Okay.
That's because I was working as a nurse in the intensive care unit and was taking care of neurosurgical patients and had the opportunity to have an invitation to come watch an operation on my day off. And it was the first time I had ever seen neurosurgery. And I just knew that day that's what I wanted to do. So I applied to medical school and went to med school in order to do that.
Wow, amazing. And what was it about that first operation? Because for some folks, it could have been the catalyst for why they did something completely different, right?
Yeah.
Seeing such a moment where someone's maybe, just facing a near-death experience where all the technical pieces involved there and the pressure of the moment could have driven someone away. For you, it brought you in. Do you remember what it was about that, Dr. Rousseau, that said, that's what I want to do?
Yeah. Well, I think again, it was the combination of the human or the personal and the scientific. In this brain tumor operation, the surgeon was nice enough, knew me from being a nurse who was taking care of his patients in the ICU, to point out anatomy that I had never seen in life before, in the operating room. And he said, "This is the seat of the soul."
Mm,
And the
wow.
idea that there was a surgery or a field, I should say, where the physical gestures that you were doing were so connected with what makes a person, you know.
Mm,
That was really profound to me. And just in taking care of patients who were having neurosurgery, I could see that it was really important to them and their families in a way that many other, even medical concerns were not. In fact,
mm-mm,
many patients and their families would feel that their lives are sort of cleaved in two, before the diagnosis and after the diagnosis, before the surgery, after the surgery, or the trauma that led to an urgent operation. And I mean, it might sound a little bit, well, I don't exactly know what to say, but I liked the idea of being involved with people during the most trying
mm,
parts of their lives. I wanted to have a stab at making a difference and doing it well, physically, scientifically, professionally, as well as personally.
wow. Yeah, oh, how gratifying of work when you get the opportunity to see that you've literally saved someone's life in real time and moments after. On the flip side of that, though, there are moments where you aren't able to help, you aren't able to support. And I think a lot of times today, going back to what I mentioned to you on the front end, what we're trying to do is help people navigate adversities and such. Everyone faces moments where maybe they fell short of what it is that their desired outcome was, or they weren't able to do something scientifically, or they weren't able to do something, if it's a real estate transaction or insurance transaction, whatever the case may be. How have you navigated those moments, Dr. Rousseau, when you've not been able to save someone's life for no fault of your own, but just because of the clinical diagnosis, that the patient may have had, didn't allow for it.
Yeah. Well, Adam, I've had the really good fortune of being surrounded by mentors, both everyone who was older than me at one point and now mentors who are largely younger than me, who are trying to do the right thing. And the right thing, of course, is doing the right operation for that patient at the right time with the right amount of skill, but it's also doing it and using the best words that you can, using
Mm,
even things like using your own posture to show that you're unhurried, sitting down rather than standing up if you're making rounds when you see that the patient or their family or both are anxious. So I've had really good examples. I'll give you a specific one. I remember being a resident, and we were at a trauma center that easily got between 12 and 20 trauma consults per 24 hours. So if you were the resident, the neurosurgery resident on call, it was just constantly putting out fires, but the fires were all people who were trying to die and die quickly. So
Mm,
it was a lot. And I remember that, there were a number of patients. When people have high blood pressure, they can have strokes. We're all familiar with that. And sometimes strokes occur in a part of the brain stem that are just not salvageable. At this point in time, we really don't have much to offer. And there was some on our team who said, we've got to cut down on these transfers for unsalvageable patients. Sometimes to decrease giving false hope to patients because or their families that the patient was being transferred to a higher level of care that might be able to do more, but also just because it would reduce the workload if we weren't having to process patients who were we were completely unable to help. But I remember our seniors saying to us, this is your job as a
mm,
neurosurgeon. It's not just to do the operation when operations have to be done. Your job is to manage this condition.
mm.
That
Love that.
includes, yeah, and I still do. So that includes being there in the emergency room in the middle of the night, if it's only to say in person, I'm so very sorry. There is nothing that can be done. That is something that is really important. Every person who's lost someone they love wants to feel like everything was done to prevent that. And
Yes.
sometimes we're the only ones who can say, yes, you did everything. The paramedics did everything. The ER team did everything. Nothing was missed. I'm here, but there's nothing that will change the outcome. And that is part of our job.
Mm.
And I was
Oh,
lucky to be trained that way. And that's how we train our residents and medical students.
I love that. Bringing the humanity front and center. I've been fortunate that I've not had anything, at this juncture in my life, major wrong, major, health wise, anything that I've had instances, going to family medicine practitioner and some other situations where years back I went in to get a colonoscopy because I was having some digestive issues. So I've had only minimal exposure with practitioners from a standpoint of what you hear other stereotypes of abrasive, non-listening, etc. And I've seen both sides, even in my short-lived experience of not having anything major. So I can only imagine that when the stakes are even higher, that you want more compassion, more empathy, more understanding from the individual who is treating you or your loved ones. And it's nice to hear that, your senior leader at that time was saying, it's your job. My
It's your,
question for you, Dr. Rousseau, and I watched you in another interview where you had mentioned that now people, not only are neurosurgeons, who are good surgeons, good at what they do, but they're good people too. And again, stereotypically speaking, from an outsider's perspective, you hear about the horror stories when, doctors are just on the go and they're moving quickly. What have you done in your career to when you see maybe bad things arising or your, residents not performing the way in which you'd like to get them back on track to keep that human component front and center, much kind of like this individual did for you back in the
yeah,
day?
yeah. Well, I think most people want to be good and they want to help others. And certainly most people who go into medicine want to help others. And it's just other things get in the way. They get busy or they start to feel like they're not being compensated or respected or whatever it is. And so their initial reason for why they're doing what they're doing kind of gets pushed to the background. And I think it's important to try to find a way, even daily, to remind yourself why you do what you do. Um, and that really carries you a long way. And you can also engage other people, the ones you work with, who are maybe not as close to it as you. And, I have the good fortune of having the front row center seat at the table of human triumph and misery, right? Sometimes the people who are uh, draining your energy, are the ones who might be, working in the accounting office and want to be sure, your billing is up to date, or they might be someone who's in charge of the electronic medical record and they want to be sure you signed your chart. All of these things that, in fact, are really important. We're all part of what it takes in modern medicine to take good care of people. But for us who are at the front row seat, it's quite a bit easier to see directly how our time and effort translates into the good. Imagine what it's like if you're working in an office where you never see patients and yet you're part of this whole big, sometimes bureaucratic machine that takes care of
Mhm.
patients. So, what I try to do, and I really try to do it every day, is in my daily interactions with people who don't have that front row seat to remind them, thank them, and say, we just did a great thing. We, meaning, you, the billing supervisor, and I, because you know what this meant for this patient or their family.
Yes.
Um, and and then everybody's on board because I think people really do want to do the good thing. We're all just getting burdened with the bureaucracy of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of culture, like how important it is for everyone to be working together. It's not just the surgeon who's performing the tactical procedure, it's all the components to make sure for a seamless experience.
You are so right. You're so right. And there's a lot of medicine these days that has a bureaucratic feel to it, for patients and for those who are delivering the care. I mean, it's on both sides. And I'll just share that something that an anecdote that I pass along a lot. I remember seeing an interview with President Obama. Now, Barack Obama worked long and hard, to create a campaign to become president. He campaigned for 2 years and all of that. And he was being interviewed, I think it was during the second term, towards the end of his presidency, and someone was asking him about the job, and he said, this is the greatest job in the world. I love it. But I'll tell you, 70% of it is the greatest job in the world. And like every other job anybody has, 30% of it can be bureaucratic. And now, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting him
Sure.
now, but the 70% is what stood out. And he said, the other parts, it's bureaucratic, it's talking to this one about that one, getting these people on board, putting out this fight, encouraging people to inspiring them to see that this part of the job is important. And I've often thought about that, and I've passed that story on to others because I thought, boy, if someone, anyone who works hard enough and successfully enough to become president of the United States is still able to honestly say, most of it is great, but yeah, there's routine parts of every job. Well, then it kind of helps you to just swallow and say, yeah, okay, it's going to be 20 or 30% is just going to be this mindless stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah.
deal
Well,
with it.
I, I'm glad you brought that up because it leads me in my mind, at least back to mindfulness, something, you mentioned on the front end of what, we're here doing in this mindful journey. And you said that, and I wrote this down. I'm going to try it in my own life. Just sitting down instead of hurriedly going through somewhere, like particularly in rounds for you. Is there something else, Dr. Rousseau, that you've done very intentionally to ensure the bureaucracy of your work and the hurried nature of what it is that you sometimes have to do can ensure that you still stay present and that you center yourself to perform at your best? It sounds like that the sitting down is actually a tactic, but is there something beyond that? I've heard of surgeons listening to music, etc. What else have you relied on to bring you back to here and now over and over again?
Well, that's nice of you to ask. I do have one personal thing that I do that I'll tell you about, and then I'll share something new that our teams are doing. So for me, I do this thing morning and evening that I call the five F's, my five F's. And they are, I just review them usually before I get out of bed in the morning and then when I go to bed at night. And they are faith, family, friends, physician. Yes, I know it doesn't start with F, but it sounds like it. And fitness. And so before I get out of bed, I think something about faith, like what is my life and the whole scheme of the cosmos. Family, I think of my husband, my children, my sisters, but my extended family,
Mhm.
my friends, and often because I'm trying to be organized, it's kind of like a checklist. I go through, you know, neighborhood friends, high school friends, college friends, med school, they sort of kind of a mental check-in so that I can remember if I want or need to check in with someone. And then physician, now that part, that's like a drop-down menu that gets expanded physician part because that's like the to-do list, the short, middle, and long-term things. What do I need to do today, tomorrow, this week, this year, month, this year, kind of thing to advance my own personal growth as a surgeon or to get back to a patient, get back to a med student or a resident, those sorts of things. And then fitness. I really do find that trying to do, I'd love to say I really did something every single day. It's probably 5 to 6 days a week. I
That's
give myself
amazing.
a day off and go to the gym 3 times a week. So those things that, and I don't have to spend any mental energy remembering what I wanted to remember. It's the five F's, and I do it in the
Yes.
morning and at night. And, over the years, and I have been doing this for years, it becomes a combination of, it's like a prayer, because there's spiritual and aspirational aspects twice a day. The evening one is, it also includes sort of how did I do on the four F's? And I'll say I'm really most often disappointed with the last one. I didn't get that workout in or something like
Yeah.
that. But so it becomes both a prayer, but also a kind of checklist.
Mm,
Um, and one thing that we've learned in medicine, that we've taken this squarely from the aviation industry, is that checklists work. That
yes.
the energy that it takes to reconstitute a list to make sure something is safe and thorough is something you don't want to have to um, dig up twice a day. If you have it as a checklist, it's just there. So
Yes.
I'll give you a great example. When I was a medical student and even a resident, there was starting to be a movement toward having post-operative patient care orders be in a sort of a template. And I remember in that case, some of our professors were against that. They said, this isn't medicine by recipe. We need time to think about and individualize the post-op plan for each patient. And the answer is kind of, well, yes and no. Yes, it should be individualized, but if every single time you're having to remember 15 or 20 areas of things that need to be addressed for this patient, you're probably going to forget something. And
Yes.
pilots found that early on. You can't forget something and fly a plane safely. And so in medicine, we moved to a template of post-op orders where you had to check a box or fill in a blank, but at least it was there to trigger your memory so you didn't forget to order food for the patient or
Yes.
IV fluids or whatever it might be. And so this works in the same way for me, that I don't have to remember what it was that I wanted to remember to think about. If you go to the Stoics, and they talk about making sure that whatever is in your mind is something that you would feel proud to have someone else know what's in your mind.
Mm,
Um, it keeps you thinking about the things you want to be thinking about. And
yes.
you don't get sucked into, doom scrolling or, whatever.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's very common today, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's powerful. I like the play on words with the physician. That makes it, going back to what you said, it kind of speaks to exactly your point that it's easy for you to remember, right? It's like just these five F's. It takes no muscle memory. It's ingrained in your brain at this point.
Yeah.
And it's funny you mentioned the checklist because I had, and you're probably familiar with his work, I assume, from being in medicine, Dr. Peter Pronovost, who's a safety expert
Yes.
who
Yes.
really drove a lot of that, from my understanding. And it was fascinating to hear his perspective when I interviewed him because, like you said, there was a lot of resistance. And I think he was at Johns Hopkins when he first implemented,
Yes.
and this was in the early 2000s, and people were against it because, well, I'm a Harvard trained MD, or, an Ivy League trained MD. I don't need to carry something with me. I'm synthesizing what you said to ask you a question on the back end of this of why do you think ego in medicine had been, and it sounds like it's kind of changing, but why had it been so prevalent that folks were unwilling to absorb and embrace something new? What can you put your finger on something that would maybe make, is it the schooling? Is it the again, I know I'm getting long-winded in this, but I'm just curious because when I heard that, I was like, well, why, if the desires to help people, to heal people, would we resist the very thing that is proven to help us heal people?
That's a really good question. Um, I think I know why, because I spent most of my life with surgeons. So we expect things to be hard. We go into a field we know that's hard, and we kind of like the hard aspect of it. In fact, we make it hard on the people who come after us because we think that hard is part of the culture, right? You know,
Mm,
you got to work 100 hours a week or you won't learn it, these kind of things. So, I'm inspired by JFK and the moonshot speech he gives, in which people asked him, or he sort of asked himself, but why should we go to the moon? We choose to do this not because it is easy, but because it is hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and our skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. So
mm,
this is, NASA's founding philosophy. It's also a founding philosophy of surgeons too. So um, I would take exception with the notion that we're unwilling to accept change. love change, but we love it in a complex direction. So if someone comes up with something like a rounding checklist that will help make things safe, or tells us wash your hands and that'll improve your outcomes, it doesn't get maybe the respect it deserves because it's not thought of as being that difficult. It might be
Mm.
uh, not appropriately valued because it's simple. So I'll give you that other example of what we're doing with the team. So when you make rounds in North America, we learned this. Not every country does it, but most Westerns do. When you make rounds and write your notes, there's something called a SOAP format, SOAP, and it's subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. And as a medical student, and we've all seen them, you're going from, the team is going from bedside to bedside. And we were taught that you organize your presentation in that way, probably because it was kind of a checklist to make sure that it was both efficient and everything was included. And so we're trying something new. We actually got funding for this. It's a bedside rounding checklist because you were mentioning Peter and Hopkins, and they very famously then came up along with Atul Gawande with the surgical checklist that was adopted by WHO. And now like 40% of operating rooms have a checklist. And, this is shocking in its simplicity that before you cut the skin, everyone takes a pause and we say, I mean, it's going to sound silly, but it really makes a difference. Who's in the room? What's your role? Is the equipment that's going to be implanted physically in the room? Is it sterile? Has the patient received the right antibiotic, the right amount of time before incision? Are we operating on the right side, the right body part, doing the right,
Yes.
all these things that you could say, oh, come on, simple, simple, simple. But the most egregious problems occur if you don't do those simple things. And
Yes.
what Atul Gawande and the group that came up with that surgical safety checklist found, and this is at 10-year follow-up, global follow-up, many continents, many countries, was that just doing that pause and that checklist, which is usually organized and run by the nurse in charge in the room, reduced morbidity, the bad outcomes by over 30%, and
Wow.
mortality, deaths by over 40%.
Wow.
There's not a fancy, sophisticated, costly bit of technology that I know of that's done the same amount of good with that kind of impact. So anyway, we looked at that and those great results for a decade. It's now over a decade that it's been pretty standard, and said we probably can get those kind of results if we organize our bedside rounding and not, forget to mention the IV and leave it in an extra day, or the urinary catheter, whatever it is. And so we decided to create a checklist really based on their work. But in addition, we wanted to expand it into sort of total well-being, which you'll
Mm.
appreciate. So
Yeah.
we now call the format SOAP SS, or sometimes SOAP SUDS, and that is we include the SOAP I mentioned, and then social and spiritual.
I love that.
And, does every doctor want to talk about social and spiritual? Well, maybe not, but somebody on the team does. The patient probably does, the family, the nurses, and it doesn't need to take a lot more time. So we've just finished a trial doing that at our partner hospital in Tanzania, and now we're doing it at our hospital in Arizona at the Barrow, and we'll report out our findings. And then there's already other partners that want to do that with us, and we'll see if this is maybe a better, safer way to do something like communicating at the bedside.
Yeah. Oh, that's so amazing. I do. You're right. I love hearing that. I just think in some of this, I'm a big believer in like how technology is positively going to impact our lives, all industries. But I also believe that there are things that can't be replicated when a human and human are sitting in the same room. The feelings that you have, it's just like that gut, right, feeling that wow, I enjoy being around this person. And it releases. I can't speak to the chemicals that it's releasing in our brain. I'm sure you can teach us about those things of what's happening in the dopamine that's being released and such. But I'd love to hear that you're really humanizing this for so long, this very technical thing that is medicine. And most of the time when people are in the bed, right, they're in the toughest moment of their life. They don't want to be there. Folks don't go to the hospital because they want to be in the hospital.
Yeah,
So
right,
I,
right.
I'm really inspired, Dr. Rousseau, by what you're saying on tying in those two S's. And I'm curious, what because I think this can be transferable. So I'm trying to bring this like back to our listeners for those who might be leading a company or entrepreneurial or whatever it is that they do in their day job. What does the SS look like for the bedside? What does the doctor have a series of questions that he or she will go through to tie in the spiritual component, the social component? What is that going to look like in this rounds?
Well, the first thing I want to say is when you say you, that is a whole group of people. It's not just me. It is a huge group. It's other faculty. It's really the project is led by our chief resident, Cyrus Salahi, and an Argentinian physician, Francisco Rivera, who's a partner with us, and many, many other people, medical students, nurses, research assistants who are all part of these bedside rounds, and all the other people who are just coming for rounds, that patient that day, who are being patient enough to allow us to use this format, which we opine, our hypothesis is that it will decrease morbidity and mortality, but we also have a qualitative component where participants in rounds like this, patients, families, and the people on the care team will have an opportunity to qualitatively evaluate it. Was it helpful? Did it just unnecessarily prolong round? So it's in the early phase. We've just completed one foreign pilot and we're just starting our current pilot at Barrow, as I said. So I'd be happy to come back and tell you more about it when we have more data. But the whole group is really excited about the potential because of the landmark work done by the aviation industry, by our colleagues who started this surgical safety checklist. So you wanted to know more about how this translates to a team if it's not physicians and bedside rounding is
Yeah, just kind of like what does the S and S on top of the SOAP look like? Is it a series of questions that they're asking the family? And then, yeah, and really just sharing those insights. And then I'm curious and you can answer this now too, like how could other leaders maybe rely on some of these things if they're having a difficult conversation with a colleague who is maybe near termination inside their workplace because they're not performing? Because from my vantage point, without knowing anything about it, it seems like there could be some transferability there.
Yeah. So we're dealing with multiple cultures, right? Rural Tanzania versus, probably the best state-of-the-art place in the United States. We're dealing with doctors and nurses, multiple specialties within all of those. Obviously, African culture, American culture, many religions, and so forth. So we actually have a laminated sheet, and we have observers who aren't part of rounds who first look at how are rounds being done, and what's being addressed and not addressed at time zero. And then there's a training about what we're going to do, why we're going to do it. So you get people to buy into it before you make them do it. So for CEOs and managers, I think that's the first thing. If you're trying to bring about or introduce a change in a culture, bring them into the change before it happens so they feel like they're part of the change. They're not just having to react to it. So
Mhm.
we had a series of in-person, online, uh, read it on your own, go through it at a program pace, whatever works for you, but be showing the respect that we're not going to start this change until every person who's going to be involved in bedside rounding has had the opportunity to see what we're going to do and why we're going to do it and why we want them to be part of it. So I think that's the first thing is kind of set yourself up for success by having respect for the people involved and include them before the change. But then after that, for efficiency, we aren't having, kumbaya sessions every patient. This is sometimes rounds are half an hour and then you have to get to the OR for the rest of the day. So we have on our sheet some examples to kind of toggle the memory of the person who's presenting. So under social, it might be, what's the occupation of the patient? Are they
Mhm.
the breadwinner for the family? Um, these kind of things. Um, if their occupation is as a singer and you're operating on their throat, that's of prime importance, and everyone needs to know that, and the patient needs to hear that you know that.
Mhm.
Like, likewise, if they're the breadwinner in their family, um, it may make some difference in the way you make decisions about when to operate, the kind of operation, the kind of rehab, these sorts of things. So those social elements are important. And also, who's making the decisions? Is it
Mhm.
the patient themselves, or if they're elderly, there's a dementia issue, who's who's enabled to make the decisions? Is the family all on board with that? These are
Mhm.
really important things that the medical team should know and the patient and family should know that we know. So those are a series of reminders about what you might include. You don't include those every time, but you make sure that some pertinent aspect of the social life of that patient is addressed, and it can take
Mhm.
10 seconds. And then spiritual. Often, but not always, it has to do with religion. The patient is a Jehovah's Witness and unwilling to have blood transfusion. Well, for a surgeon, that's hugely important because what you do at surgery, the whether you do surgery may be impacted by that. Or the
Mhm.
patient's not a Jehovah's Witness, but their partner is, and there's going to be issues around this. Or even if there's no religion per se that they have or religious issue, the patient is, this has been addressed. The patient is agnostic or atheist and has politely asked that we not bring this up.
Mhm.
Okay, then we won't bring it up. The patient is Catholic, but is angry at the church and they want to have a Protestant minister. It's just something that humanizes the experience for them. And
Yeah.
those are in a little sheet that will just help someone efficiently review. And here's what I'm going to say today about social and spiritual.
Yeah, no, thank you for elaborating. That is helpful. And I like what you said, on the front end of that. Like if there's leader of a team here today who's listening that, including your folks in that decision-making process, making them part of it and having an ownership. And I'm so intrigued by what you're doing. I want to circle back with you on this to see how what your data shows and what the findings are, because I personally think that there's going to be, as you mentioned, probably a decrease in, mortality and morbidity, because you're getting to know the full patient and
Yeah.
asking meaningful questions. So that's amazing. I want to be
I'd like
mindful.
to, if I may, I
Please,
just want
please, of
to
course.
thank our funders who are the Interfaith America, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to making religious pluralism a social norm in the United States within one generation, and is increasingly working in healthcare settings, but not limited to that. And the Barrow Neurologic Institute Chairman's Fund, so these things require that somebody be paid to collect data if we want objective observers. So our nurse, medical student, and non-clinical people who do the checklist, not the participants, it's our job to do rounds, but the people who keep the data are paid research assistants, and Interfaith America and Barrow support those funds.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's so important to have groups who are on board and dollars. What you can have great ideas, but if you don't have dollars to support it, the ideas can die a lot of times. So thank you for sharing that. I want to be respectful of your time, of course, and so I could talk to you for hours. I've got so many more questions, boiling in my mind. Maybe we'll have to do an episode two down the road. I am curious, going back to your personal life, Dr. Rousseau, and I shared with you on the front end. This is a question I ask of every guest, and your answers to your level of comfort, of course. But one of the things that we're striving to do in Mindful Journey, as I mentioned on the very front end, is humanize this shared experience of life for people to hear that, hey, you know what? I'm not alone in my journey. I think so many times today, because of social media, it's easy to compare yourself to others, right? Say, oh, that person, they've got more accolades than me. They got the promotion and I didn't. They've got a better body, a better husband, a better wife, better kids, better grandkids. And it's just the doom scrolling I think you mentioned before, we can all get sucked into at times. And there's an old adage that says comparison is the thief of joy. And I firmly believe that to be true. So what we're wanting to do through this question is let listeners know that, hey, it's okay to be going through something. We've all gone through something. And folks may look at someone like yourself who, is credentialed and, however folks may define success is successful, right? Done great things in the world. And that you too have still faced your own hardships. So, with all of that being said, again, to your level of comfort, Dr. Rousseau, what is the most challenging thing that you've gone through in your life? And what do you recall having done to get through it?
I'm glad you brought up that sort of comparison. I've always liked that comparison as the thief of joy. I think that's true, or the thing that I was taught early on. In fact, I had it on my college. It was framed for me by a roommate in college, and that's the desiderata, which starts out, go placidly amid the noise and haste, for there will always be greater and lesser persons than yourself. And if you
Mm,
just like, that's the first line. And if you just remember that, okay, there's always going to be greater and lesser people than myself. And the older you get, you meet people who are famous and celebrities, they still feel there's greater and lesser people than themselves. It is true in life. So that should help. But in terms of my personal experiences, I'll I'll start with one. You'll laugh at how trivial it seems in retrospect, but when I was in seventh or eighth grade, um, I didn't make the cheerleading squad that year, and it was really important to me. I mean, I feel almost embarrassed to tell you this, but at the time, that was a big deal. And I came home and threw myself into a project right after school, but I was tearful. I was crying, and my dad came home from work, and knew from talking to my mother that I was upset. And what he said to me was really helpful, but not right away. He said, I'm really sorry that happened to you. All I can say is that if that's the worst thing that ever happens to you, you'll have lived a very good and happy life. And at the time, I almost took it as a put down, the way 13-year-olds might, like, you don't understand how important this is to me. But of course, it wasn't too long. And then for the rest of my life, I've realized that he's absolutely right. And so I was able to think about that myself when something happened and it seems really bad and say, well, if this now is the worst thing that ever happens to me, can I still consider myself to have had a happy life? And, in all cases, yes. So that framing of the big bad thing and the overall context of a life, it it may not help a person in that minute when you're both sad and kind of feeling sorry for yourself, but it does help, and it did help me. The second thing, the period that I would say is more recent because it's in my adult life, and it was a time when it just seemed like everything that was meaningful to me was kind of falling apart at the same time. Patients who weren't doing well, conflicts on the job with, other faculty, you know, spouses having their own issue and, doesn't want to walk through it with you. Certainly I'm a breadwinner and, if you're going to change jobs because of conflict, will there be financial aspects to it or even legal? It just felt like, wow, all the big ticket things are kind of going south all at once. And that was really hard for me. And it was especially hard because I felt alone in it.
Mm.
And the thing that helped me was really to just take that whole like feeling of the tsunami and break it down into the individual problems. Okay, well, what is the occupational thing? What can you do on that? And then even writing it down, making a list, if then this and that. What on the financial? Okay, if the worst thing happened, is our family gonna be okay for 6 months? And on so that getting some granularity to each of the problems and dealing with them as one problem rather than five or six at once. And this happens with patients too. We see this in ourselves. We see it on rounds. Somebody gets moved to the ICU, and I talked about how we organize the way we present on rounds. Well, we also do it by the O part is by organ systems. And if you say, well, neurologically, well, they're unconscious, cardiovascular, they have cardiac arrhythmias, renal, their kidneys are out and they might have to go on dialysis, gastrointestinal, all their GI bleeding. There's a tendency if all the systems are breaking down, multi-organ failure to say, this patient's not going to survive. But if you think about it, you know, just system by system. What do we need to get them alert again? What's going on with their heart? How do we address that? What do we do for the kid? All of a sudden, both there's things that you can do, the patient can be more hopeful, the family can be more hopeful, and you're more likely to be successful if you aren't so nihilistic, you know?
Yeah.
So that's been helpful for me.
That's super helpful, and I trust those who have heard or will hear will undoubtedly find value. What I'm gathering from you is really just breaking it down, like, and it reminds me of an old quote that says, "Complexity is the enemy of execution." When things are too difficult, we don't act.
Yes.
So really love that, and thank you for your vulnerability, and again, it reminds myself, and I think all that. Um, Neurosurgeons are just people, right? You're sometimes we can put doctors up on a pedestal in society, and and not just doctors. I'm not just, being presumptuous about your specialty, but sometimes when we do that, it makes us feel like we're so alone and isolated. And hearing you say that, wow, yeah, I was dealing with the things that all people deal with, right? Challenges maybe at home, financials, it's things, etc. I'd love to kind of on the back end of that, hear from you, being that you are in such a high pressure field. What did you do to separate, those challenges so that it didn't impact performance when you were coming into work? How did you? I know the five F's are very important to you, Dr. Rousseau, but is there something else that you can recall? That allowed you, this kind of goes back to my centering question before, and perhaps it's the same thing, but is there something else like that you, when you got into the workplace, maybe you looked yourself in the mirror and said, okay, I've got to be my best today. Like, do you recall anything like that that helped you in those moments?
Yeah. I have what helps me are stories of other people. And I'm a big reader of biographies. And because I love history, but I love it through the lens of, well, how did this person or the people around them deal with whatever the issues were of their time? Because, how are we addressing the issues of our time? So I can recall thinking about, well, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound egotistical. I don't compare myself at all to great people of history, but I have thought, well, how would how would FDR frame this problem? The guy had polio, couldn't stand up, but yet he was able to deal with something big.
Mm.
Or Theodore Roosevelt loses his wife and his mother in the same house in the same day and writes, the light has gone out of my life. He was completely despondent with a 2 day old infant, and physical activity helped him. So um, I a lot of times I'll think, how how would someone who I've read about, they may not be famous, but it might be something I've read in a newspaper, how they handled this or that. I'll give a simple, maybe it's a silly example, but I'll see if I can get through it without crying here, but when my own dad died, and I'm the oldest in my family, so I knew it would come to me to give the eulogy. I mean, I should be able to, gear it up, step it up, and this is what you do. But I knew it was going to be really, really hard. And um, so I remembered, I took a real example from two brothers-in-law I have who had to do that for parents before I did. And I so admired them. And I remember sitting in, the pew at church thinking, I would never be able to do that if one of my parents died. And yet it happens, and I had to do it. So thinking about other people, famous or not famous, who have had to do hard things and not and in a sort of humble way saying they can do it, I'm going to do it too. Not better than them, but if they can do it, I should force myself to do it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that mindset. It really flips it on its head. It no longer seems impossible. It doesn't seem, it's like very relatable now, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, two questions if time still permits. Are you still good for a few? Okay. I'm curious what you've spent years operating on the brain. So you've obviously seen things that I'm sure have impacted you in your own life. And I'm just curious what, being a neurosurgeon has taught you about how it is that you show up in your own life as it relates to your brain health, or as it relates to things that you avoid or do, et cetera. I know broad question, but what has being in the brain, literally seeing it, touching it, feeling it, taught you about your life?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And I'll say, yeah, I have thought about this. And the bottom line is if you do what I do every day and for a career, and you're not thinking about what's important in life and not thinking about it could all end tomorrow, then shame on you because you have blinders on. I mean, the number one cause of traumatic death in the world is traumatic brain injury. 6 million people a year. It's like, the number of deaths from COVID every year, year in, year out. So if you are thinking seriously about your life's work and you're not thinking about, not in a maudlin way, but if it all ended tomorrow in the things that I'm aware of, and you don't have to be a neurosurgeon to have this, because we all read about disasters. I mean, that's one of the few good things about doom scrolling, right? Is that you hear about this poor person who's walking their dog and a tree falls on them and kills them,
Yeah.
that I mean, and all of the conflict zones and whatnot in the world. So we none of us need examples to remind us that tomorrow is promised to none of us. So I think in a non-maudlin sort of way to just try to be productive with the concept that tomorrow isn't promised. So
Mhm.
live today well. Uh, doesn't mean don't show up to work because the surf's up, but within reason, if this were your last day, are you spending it a way that your celestial self would feel proud of?
Great, great wisdom. Great, great wisdom. And speaking of doom scrolling again, I interviewed someone who's, kind of like a dopamine expert. Dr. Anna Lemke, she's a psychiatrist out of Stanford.
Yeah.
So she talked a lot. I know you guys are in different specialties, of course, but I'm curious, are you able to, if you were to put somebody's brain after scrolling, like what are you seeing on the scan? Is there some tangible things that you've heard of in your world that that we should maybe do less of because it's actually impacting our brain in a negative way?
Yeah. Well, there's, the quest for more dopamine. Dopamine is, in some ways a good thing, right? It initiates motor movement and it smooths motor movement, but there's also some aspects of multiple neurotransmitters that are in addictive behaviors, whether it's addictive substances or addictive practices like overuse of screens and things that we probably want to avoid, right? So
Hmm.
some balance of using technology for its good aspects, ways we can stay in touch with family and friends and patients and coworkers, but also not just filling empty hours. I mean, I have great respect for the value of the human brain just thinking in nature is even better, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, beautiful.
and we need to do more of that.
Yes, yes, beautiful advice. I'd love to close just on an inspiring note. I know we've covered a variety of topics, but if there's someone listening today, Dr. Rousseau, who's inspired by your words and is saying, hey, I can implement some of these things in my life, but this divorce is weighing me down, or this flat tire is weighing me down, or this, relationship with my kid is weighing me down, whatever that thing may be, they're hearing the information, but they don't know how to act on it, and they're maybe in a hopeless state. What's your message to that person today to help them find hope again?
Yeah. It gets better. That's my message. It does get better. It's, my dad's advice to 13-year-old me. It's not something that I made up or he made up. There are campaigns that are gets better campaigns, but it is so true. And I would also say, not only does it get better, but don't do anything that will prevent you from having the time for it to get better. It may get better right away. It may take a little bit of time. You may need a little bit more help, but it will get better. And so don't do anything drastic or dramatic. Don't close the door on a relationship, an opportunity, on your own health. It will get better, and don't do anything that will prevent some pathway for it to get better.
Amazing advice. I'm so grateful to you. It was so
I
nice
am.
chatting with you. You've been a wonderful guest and so easy to chat with, Dr. Rousseau. I'm so excited to learn more about what it is that you're going to do in the future, especially with with the two S's in the research currently. I'd love to keep in touch, and I'll send you a note to follow up after this offline with a link to this recording. But again, deeply grateful for what it is that you're doing in the world through neurosurgery and beyond, and then just spending time with us here today. Thank you so much.
Oh, Adam, thank you. I look forward to learning from you and your other interviewees on your podcast. So thank you.
My pleasure. Have a great day. Take
Thank
care.
you, you
See you,
too.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.